There is a very traditional piece of advice that we tend to give people when they want to learn a new craft. Start small. Learn the basics. Practice the fundamentals. Work your way up to that one project. And eventually, once you know enough, you finally get through the gates and make the thing that you wanted to make in the first place. That makes perfect sense. But I don't necessarily think it's the only way to learn a craft, and depending on the person, I don't know if it's the best way to learn a craft either, because there's another way that people learn, and it typically begins at the other end of that hierarchy. Hi, my name is Taylor, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands podcast. Today I want to talk to you about something that I'm referring to here as modern apprenticeship. With the amount of instruction we have access to online now, I think that this has become an incredibly common way for people to learn how to make things. And through making those things, essentially learning the lay of the land in terms of the craft. Knitting is the easiest example for me because clearly that's the craft I know best. And recently I've been talking to a lot of newer knitters, and by a lot, it's like maybe 5. I've noticed something common between them. They got into knitting because there was something specific they wanted to make. Often it's a sweater. So for today's example, I am going to use a sweater. However, for anybody, it could be anything. It could be a special hat, it could be a pair of socks, it could be a blanket, anything. The point is that these folks started their knitting journey with a project they wanted to make. They didn't sit down one day and think, I would like to acquire a comprehensive foundational education in hand knitting. They saw the sweater and they wanted it. Much better motivation, frankly. So they find a pattern, and maybe they find a YouTube tutorial that walks them through it, and they start knitting. Now, there can absolutely be problems with this. Of the newer knitters that I've met, and ones I've met in the past, these folks have made things, substantial projects, and don't really know what gauge is or what blocking is. And I don't mean that they know that they're supposed to swatch and have elected not to because they enjoy living dangerously. I mean that they've never been introduced to blocking or swatching. They successfully followed the steps of the project without necessarily encountering some of the larger principles of the craft. And it would be easy to look at that and say, well, there's the problem. They started with the project instead of the fundamentals. Except I don't think that starting with the project is the problem. Because when it's done well, the project can actually be how you learn the foundation and fundamentals in the first place. Now, for folks that have been around for a while, you may know this, but for those of you that are new here, you may not know this. I taught 4th grade for 8 years, and then I taught gifted and talented education for an additional 2 years prior to leaving education to have my first child in 2015. Now, in the time that I was teaching, one of my main focuses in terms of the way that I approached teaching and pedagogy, one of my main focuses, ways I loved to teach new skills, was through something that was referred to at the time, and I called it as well, project-based learning. Instead of teaching a collection of information and skills in isolation, and then eventually giving students something to do with them, you can give them a meaningful problem and then allow that problem to create a need for the learning. There's actually a pedagogical model for this called the experiential learning cycle. This is most closely associated with an educational learning theorist by the name of David Kolb. The terminology is more academic than we need here, but the overall idea is quite simple. You have an experience, you reflect on what happened, you develop some understanding from it, and then you use the understanding to try something new, which gives you another experience. So essentially, you do something, you see what happened, figure out why, use what you learned, and then you try again. And if you make things, that probably sounds very familiar. Let's go back to the new knitter. They want to make a sweater. Great. So that's our way in. That's the thing that's going to take us on the tour. They find a good guide, and the first thing that they're asked to do is make a swatch. They knit one. It's too small. Why? Why? Now they're learning about tension and needle size. They change the needle and they try again. Eventually they get gauge and start knitting a sweater. Wouldn't it be great if it was quite that simple? What the hell are short rows? New problem, new knowledge. Why are we increasing here? Why? Now we're learning about fit. Why does my sweater look like absolute garbage right now? Oh, blocking. And suddenly none of these things are abstract pieces of knowledge anymore. They matter because the project has made them matter. Gauge matters because the sweater needs to fit. Ease matters because a size has to be chosen. Those increases matter because they're changing the shape of the garment in your hands. That knowledge has an immediate application, and that's the sweet spot. That's what keeps people coming back, and that's what keeps the learning going. Learning through a project is so powerful because we love that immediate gratification of being able to use what we've just learned in something real. I feel like this is how I learned how to knit. I usually reference the book Knitting for Dummies as what taught me how to knit. And in essence, it did teach me the stitches on how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch and all of that to even get me started down the path of looking for a project. But I didn't read the entire book Knitting for Dummies from cover to cover and then decide now it's time for me to go embark on a project. I can't think of anybody. I don't know who would do that, but I certainly did not. It didn't take very long before I saw something and knew I want to make that. I'm going to make that. And then whatever comes up, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. And come hell or high water, you absolutely will cross that bridge. The book, however, was incredibly important to me because a pattern would ask me to do something I didn't know how to do. What is this? How do I do this? Why am I doing it? I'd figure out enough to understand what was happening and then immediately apply it to what I was making. Another project would introduce something else. Back to the book, back to Google, back to some place to go find those foundational pieces that were missing. Learn it, use it, and keep going. So Knitting for Dummies wasn't really my curriculum. The project was my curriculum. The book was just my reference. You don't necessarily need to possess the entire foundation of a craft before you start making things. You need access to reliable foundational information when the work gives you a reason to seek it out. There's another part of experiential learning that anybody who makes anything will recognize right away. Sometimes you don't know you need to learn something until you've already screwed it up. And sometimes you get a little too far into something before you realize it's gone rather spectacularly wrong, which is frustrating. It wastes time. Sometimes it wastes materials. Sometimes you have to undo 3 evenings worth of work while reconsidering every step and decision you made that brought you to this point. But having to diagnose a problem yourself can be an incredibly effective teacher. Maybe nobody told you that this particular yarn was likely to grow 3 times after washing. So you make the thing, you wash it, it grows. A lot. Well, now you start figuring out what happened. Fiber content, yarn construction, gauge, fabric density. The next time you encounter something similar, you notice. You have experience now. Someone could have warned you beforehand, and that warning might have saved you an enormous headache. But living through the problem gives you something different. You know what it looks like. And eventually, all those experiences accumulate into judgment. Starting with a project doesn't automatically mean that you're going to learn the craft through the project. You can follow instructions and successfully make something without really understanding the principles about what's happening underneath those instructions. You know, do this for 6 inches, put these over here, finish this, done. You've made the thing, but you've mostly learned the workflow for the project. Another teacher could take you through essentially the same project while exposing you to the principles underneath it. I looked closely at 3 complete sweater tutorials recently, and they're really useful examples for this because they're providing different kinds of instruction for different learners. Jessica McDonald's first sweater tutorial is extremely comprehensive. She's teaching the sweater, but she's also teaching the thinking surrounding it. Sizing and ease, yarn requirements, substitutions, needles, gauge, blocking, and when she gets to gauge, she isn't simply saying, check your gauge. She's explaining why the needle size in the pattern is only the starting point, why your knitting might require something different, and what you're actually trying to accomplish. She's making some of that thinking of a more experienced knitter visible so that somebody who doesn't have that experience yet can get a first taste of why all of these things are happening. And then we have Florence Miller's step-by-step sweater tutorial. It does something similar. Her gauge swatch becomes both practice and information. You practice stitches and techniques, but then you're washing the swatch, measuring it, and then using what happened to make decisions about the sweater sizing. That little square has a real serious job in that tutorial. And then another tutorial I watched was for Veronica Lindbergh's late checkout sweater. That one still demonstrates and explains plenty, but it seems particularly well suited to somebody who already comes to the table with a little bit of knitting context. At one point, there's a reminder essentially to just check your gauge. And then from there you move on. And if you know what gauge is, got it, great. If you've never heard of gauge, there's an entire lesson hiding inside of that one instruction. Neither approach is wrong. One learner may come at it saying, I know some knitting, knitting, just show me how to make this sweater. Another one might come to the table saying, I want to make this sweater. Teach me knitting while we do it. If you're learning through projects, knowing which kind of guide you need is incredibly important. I actually just received a comment on a video. I like just today I received a comment on a video and I thought this is incredible because this is a lot like what we're talking about right now, and I want to share it with you because this person seems to be very in tune with what it is that they need, what kind of instruction they would need to accomplish the project. This comes from Fairy Crochet Mama, and it says, the only way I would buy this pattern would be if there was a tutorial because I crochet a lot more than knit, and while I know the basic stitches, after reading the Ravelry notes, I know I would get frustrated. I would need help with it. This is a person who knows their boundaries, and it's not even their boundaries. They know their current limitations, and they want to make sure that they get the help that they need so they can be successful with that. They understand they're going to need more help than what the pattern is there to provide. Now, whether that means they should avoid knitting that hat until somebody does a full-on tutorial for that hat, or whether they should go ahead and start knitting that hat and seek out tutorials piecemeal for the techniques in that hat, that really is up to that particular learner. But that is a learner who understands their limitations and knows what they're going to need to make sure they have success in a particular project. I thought that was very fitting, and I think it's a really cool approach, because something that I find really fascinating through all of this is how it really starts to look something like apprenticeship. There's something surprisingly old-fashioned about this very modern way of learning. Historically, one of the ways that people learned crafts was by working alongside someone who was a master in that craft. You watched, you tried, they demonstrated, you participated in actual work. And ideally, over time, you weren't merely copying what their hands were doing. You were also learning why they were doing it. There's actually an educational concept called cognitive apprenticeship that takes this particularly seriously, making the thinking behind skilled work visible to the learner. A really good online craft teacher can do something remarkably similar. You're watching their hands, yes. But the valuable part is when they let you into their head. Why did I choose this material? What am I looking for here? What would tell me that something has gone wrong? That's the apprenticeship part, and video has some interesting advantages on its own. You can pause your teacher, rewind them, slow the video down, and watch the movement at half speed. On a device that supports it, you can actually pinch zoom into the viewing window to get a little bit of a closer look.
And then I'm gonna go in, so I'm not gonna go in totally here at the edge. I'm gonna go in like one.
You can make them demonstrate the same thing 14 times. And if one person's explanation doesn't click, then you can go find somebody else. Your apprenticeship can be assembled from multiple teachers. But there's one major thing that the person on screen cannot do. They can't see what you're missing. A craftsperson sitting beside you can watch what you're doing. They can say, hang on, before you do that, you need to know this. Dead. A video can't do that. It can say, check your gauge, and it has no idea that you don't know what gauge is. It just keeps playing, which means this kind of self-directed apprenticeship is asking something really important of the learner. Curiosity. Not knowing everything, just being willing to notice. Wait. I don't understand that. Why are we doing this? What does that word even mean? Why did mine behave differently? Why? Is this supposed to look like that? And again, sometimes you won't notice until something goes wrong. That's fine too. Now the problem becomes the next lesson. And this is why I still think a solid reference is so valuable. For me, it was Knitting for Dummies. For somebody else, it might be a book, a class, a website, an actual teacher, a collection of trusted online resources, a knitting group that you can go to every Saturday full of people who have all kinds of accumulated knowledge on the craft that are more than happy to share what they know with you. The medium isn't really the point. You just need somewhere reliable to take the questions that your work produces. There's a really big difference between already possessing all of the foundational knowledge and having access to it when you discover that you need it. I think that the second is absolutely enough to begin. At first, you're mostly following instructions. That's fine. Everybody starts somewhere. But gradually, you begin to understand the principles underneath them. And now you can make choices. You're not just reproducing somebody else's workflow anymore. You're developing judgment. You're beginning to think outside the craft. So if somebody told me that they wanted to learn a craft because there was one particular thing that they really wanted to make, I don't think that I would tell them to, put that idea away and start with the foundational skills first. Make the washcloth or whatever. I I'd tell them to start there. Start with the project, because it's the project that makes them want to learn. Find a guide that matches where you are and keep a reliable reference within reach. Then pay attention. Ask questions of the work. Let the mistakes teach you something and keep going, because eventually something very subtle begins to happen. You stop needing every decision made for you, and you start recognizing problems before they become disasters. You start knowing which questions to ask, and you choose instead of simply follow. And one day, you realize that that thing you set out to make wasn't the chocolate factory at all. It was the golden ticket.